Bisexual men have been largely absent from games, only showing up in the mainstream in any noticeable numbers relatively recently. And even though this has started to improve, it's important that we make sure it improves in the right direction. As we'll see, just because a game includes a bi man doesn't mean it represents him well, and often games have done more harm than good by including images of us that reinforce existing negative stereotypes about us. Let's start by differentiating good representation from bad representation. At the most basic level, good representation presents a realistic and sympathetic view of what it's representing, whereas bad representation presents a harmful view that reinforces negative stereotypes. The best kind of representation you can make is a realistic one, which sounds obvious, but it's not something we think about very much. So I'm going to emphasize it. The vast majority of representation bisexual men get is a type of character I've heard called a player-sexual character. And I know that's kind of a dumb name, but as I describe the concept, you might begin to recognize what I'm talking about. There's some pretty specific conditions for a character to be player-sexual. First, the game the character is in has to have a romance mechanic. The player must be able to flirt with, date, or even just sleep with the character in question. Second, the player must be able to choose their own character's gender, so that the player character can have different genders on different playthroughs of the game. You might be able to see where I'm going now. A player-sexual character is a character that can be romanced, regardless of the player character's gender, but either only refers to other partners of the opposite gender, or doesn't mention other partners at all. This type of character is seen a lot in games like Mass Effect, or Saints Row, or Assassin's Creed, or Elder Scrolls. In games like these, most or all of the cast of NPCs tend to be player-sexual. It's sort of the default, and because it's sort of the default, it feels a lot more like a game mechanic than a part of a given character's identity. And while player-sexual characters are, in the most technical sense, bisexual, including a player-sexual character isn't an active choice on the part of the developer. It is only the act of not going the extra mile to prevent the player from romancing a character of the same gender. While there's something to be said for not going that extra mile, because some games do, it's not enough. The center of my issue with player-sexual characters is their dependence on player choice. If a player chooses to romance one of these characters while their own is of the same gender, great. But if they decide to go for a straight relationship, there's nothing about the character that would identify them as bisexual. Their identity is born only out of a game mechanic, not out of the character's own past or identity. Now, I'm not asking people to start slapping bi pride flags on every NPC, nor am I asking people to stop making player-sexual characters. Their existence isn't a problem in and of itself. But the fact that it's pretty much the only form of representation bi men get is a problem. Because there are precious few canonically bisexual men in games. I was only able to find about 5. There are probably some more, but I doubt I was able to compile a comprehensive list, but since we're talking about the mainstream here, finding characters with high visibility is more important than considering literally every game with a bi dude in it. And that absence of bisexual men is a pretty big problem in and of itself. Bi men being largely absent from mainstream games is not good because it doesn't reflect reality. A choice, probably an unconscious one, but a choice nonetheless, has been made to exclude us from games and the stories they tell, and I for one do not appreciate it. But to make matters worse, a couple of those precious few canonically bisexual men are fulfilling some extremely harmful stereotypes. Obligatory disclaimer, I've probably missed someone obvious, because that is the curse of the researcher, and I do want to say that by no means do I mean to claim that every bisexual man ever depicted in a game looks like the following bad examples, but some of them do, so we're going to address that. I'm going to put the worst offender I found first, just to get him out of the way. Trevor Phillips from Grand Theft Auto V is a terrible representation of bisexuality. If you've played the game, you might already recognize why I take issue with him. He's one of the 3 playable protagonists of the game, and is characterized by his extreme violence, his extreme unpredictability, and his honesty about those previous 2 traits. Throughout the game, he sexually assaults multiple men, and admits to doing so in the past as well. It's alluded to throughout the game that he himself was sexually assaulted in his youth, potentially leading to his current personality. He's generally portrayed as a violent psychopath, albeit a sympathetic, violent psychopath. He's also the only main character that isn't straight. In case you don't immediately see the problem here, which is fine, because not all of us have had to experience or learn about this, one of the most prevalent forms of biphobia is framing bisexuality as a mental illness. Something tragic, something wrong. Trevor is a textbook form of this. He's troubled, he's dangerous, and he violently lashes out because of his psychological trauma. His bisexuality is implied to be a part of these symptoms, a result of his trauma, not just something about him. And that is not accurate to reality. Bisexuality is not a mental illness, it's just the way some people are. Fortunately, Trevor was the worst example of a bi man I found in my research. Although there are plenty of other horrible representations of the LGBT community in games, that is an entirely different video. The only other really egregious example of bad representation I found wasn't from the mainstream, so we can disregard it a little bit, but it still exists. It was from a game called Clive Barker's Jericho, which I'd never heard of before. And the character I found from it was an obese Roman governor who claims it's been a while since he's tasted both genders, and was one of the villains pitted against the protagonist, which isn't great, but fortunately, this example wasn't super mainstream, so its impact is a little reduced. And while these incidents are present, and can act as warnings for things that can and do happen in games, fortunately they also weren't super common. That may just be because bi men aren't super common in games in general, but there are also examples of bi men in games that are just fine, or even pretty good. Let's take a look at how to properly include a bisexual man in a game. Starting with Borderlands 2, which is a game with 2 whole bisexual men in it. That is a pretty good chunk of my list. Axton, one of the main playable characters, is revealed to be bisexual in one of the games, and he's done just fine. I consider him pretty good representation, if it weren't for the fact that his lines involving flirting with men were originally a bug and the devs just decided to lean into it. I appreciate that they did, and I'm not really bashing them, but next time I'd appreciate being represented on purpose. But all things considered, Axton is pretty good representation. Mr. Torg, from the same game, is also a pretty good representation of bisexual men. He is sort of a caricature of hypermasculinity, but that's not really a caricature of bisexuality, and even his hypermasculinity is subversive. He is a caring, his motives are caring, and he has a kind heart. He's a character where his bisexuality is just a part of him, which is how it really works. I do wish it was a little more overt so the devs wouldn't have felt the need to confirm his sexuality in an interview outside of the game, but that's a pretty minor gripe in this case. These two provide reasonably good examples of how to include a bi man in a game like Borderlands, with a light but excellent focus on narrative over gameplay. Alternatively, games focused entirely on narrative can follow the absolutely golden standard of Night in the Woods. Night in the Woods is an adorable indie game. I highly recommend it, about a depressed cat named May who dropped out of college, but right now we're not concerned with her. We're more concerned with her best friend, Greg, and his boyfriend, Angus. Greg and Angus are, obviously, dating. They are for the whole game. They have been since before the game. Their relationship is healthy, and because the story isn't fully about them, it doesn't have any drama attached to it. It's just part of the background of their characters. It's sweet, it exists, and it is not the focus of the story, which is perfect. Greg and Angus are gay characters that exist in a story that's not about being gay, but they're still portrayed as just normal people in a normal relationship, and while they aren't technically bi, this kind of representation translates to a bisexual man perfectly. There are parallels between gay men and bi men. Of course, not every game has the time to put into this form of representation. Most games don't, really. And I'm not saying that gay relationships in games aren't allowed to be tumultuous or unhealthy, but right now that's pretty much all we have, and I would appreciate some variety because variety reflects reality better. And reflecting reality is our goal here. But, if the game doesn't have time for that, games like Overwatch, and more recently, Apicks Legends, who added a bi man to my list in Gibraltar, just sort of stating that some of their characters are gay, is a perfectly fine form of representation. These games aren't about being part of the LGBT community, but they include people from it anyway, and that's exactly how life works. That's exactly how these games' player bases work. Some people feel uncomfortable with it and claim that it's forced, but it really isn't. My logic is that once you start getting more and more characters into a single given game, what are the odds that every single one is straight? And if you aren't trying to reflect reality with your representation of gay people, that means you're making a choice to do so. And if the choice you make is to exclude us, well, we don't appreciate that. Honestly, I'd like a little more tact than just a game dev listing a character's sexuality in their bio, but for some games, that's really all they have time for. And there's a nice side effect to the fact that bisexual men have been historically underrepresented. The mainstream gaming scene hasn't trapped itself into a favorite stereotype yet. There's only been one Trevor Phillips so far, so we have time to influence that and make sure that as more bi men appear in games, they appear as honest and truthful portrayals of what it really means to be bisexual. I, for one, cannot wait to watch my list get longer. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed what I've done here, and shout out to Aaliyah for pushing all of us to make these video essays. This essay was created for the History of Digital Games, or ARTG ADH, at UC Santa Cruz for Professor Aaliyah Dark. Thank you again, and I hope it helped you learn about something new. Goodbye.